Despite his sexual problems, he fathered 2 children, daughter Lyudmila and son Yuri. Chikatilo was determined to better himself. His quest for self-improvement brought him to Rostov University, where he studied literature as an external student. One of his classmates was Tamara Tolomayenko.
There was a report on the radio that the trial was beginning in Rostov of a 56-year-old sex maniac named Andrei Chikatilo. I immediately thought about the name and remembered that I had studied with an Andrei Chikatilo at university. I knew that he was older than I was. The rest of us were younger. So I got out the photograph straight away. After taking it, I looked at it for a long time. He had the kind of eyes that it was unpleasant to look at, even in a photograph. Maybe it was a kind of magnetism in his eyes which made it possible for him to kill so many people, to make them agree to go with him when he asked them.
Chikatilo moved into teaching immediately after graduating from university. As he admitted at his trial, the killing of little Lena Zakotnova in 1978 was the climax of an escalating series of assaults on his pupils, both boys and girls. The classrooms were full of rumors about his activities, but his colleagues were not sure whether to believe them. The school authorities did nothing. It wasn't until 1981 that Chikatilo, then aged 45, was finally drummed out of teaching. No one reported him to the police.
The most noticeable thing about him was that whenever he spoke to anyone, whether to a child or an adult, he never looked them straight in the eye. His eyes were always wandering. There were rumors about him. The boys called him queer. Maybe the school authorities did take note of it. It was all within their competence, on their level. As for us, we heard the rumors, but as they say, boys will be boys, and they could have been saying anything about him.
By now, Chikatilo's terrible sexual obsession was beginning to take hold of him. Long after he killed Lena Zakotnova, he was still reliving what he had done. Rostov's busy railway station, with its crowds of young women, was like a magnet. Chikatilo would spend hours walking the platforms in search of victims. More and more, he spent the night on benches in the waiting room, with the tramps and the prostitutes. We were brought up to believe that all sex was harmful, that we must only work in industry and build communism. All the rest was unnecessary. It was useless. And I was convinced that if it was unnecessary, it didn't matter if I couldn't get my thing to stand up. I wasn't sorry. But all this pressed down on my brain. I didn't want to go there, but the people kept coming, masses of them. You have to lie with beggars for the whole night at railway stations when you go on a business trip, because there are never any vacancies in the hotels. So the people went there, and so did I. I watched a couple of times, and then I became infected. It's just like drugs. By autumn 1981, Chikatilo could resist no longer. Outside Rostov Public Library on the evening of September 3rd, he met Larisa Kachenko, aged 17. They made an unlikely couple. He had been in the reading room, catching up on the communist newspapers. She was on her way to join a youth brigade working in the fields. But when Chikatilo proposed going off together to relax on the river beach, she agreed. They walked together down Rostov's main street, chatting as they went. His years spent as a teacher had given him the ability to talk to young people. Kachenko appears to have suspected nothing as Chikatilo led her down to the opposite bank of the River Don on the outskirts of the city. He promised to buy her food and drink at the leisure complex on the river beach. But they never got there. It was warm summer weather, and they walked through looking for somewhere without people, where they could be alone. At that time, the woods here were much thicker than now. The trees have been cut down since. And he brought her to this place where he tried to have sex with her. But because of his impotence, he didn't succeed in finishing the sexual act. And after that, he killed her. And then he left. The killing spree began. The unusual thing about Chikatilo's victims was their diversity. Some were young, innocent children. Others were tramps or cheap prostitutes. They were so different from one another that police were convinced they were dealing not with one, but with several killers. The problem was in those early years that, as a rule, beginning in 1982, we were finding bodies which were little more than skeletons. We couldn't establish the identity of the deceased. It was only after the Institute in Moscow made a reconstruction of the skull that we were able to identify 12 people. We were unable to start our work with the main thing, and that, of course, was the deceased. One of them was 11-year-old Sasha Chapel. It was a warm summer evening in August 1984, and he'd been out with a friend to the cinema in Rostov. It was the last time the two boys saw each other, as Sasha's grandmother remembers.
After the film, they went to Voroshilovsky Prospect, from where the number 10 tram left. Vasily was there with his little brother, and Sasha said to him, "There's your number 10 tram. You go, and I'll wait here for mine." That is what Vasily told the police.
And that was the last you saw of him?
That was all. Then a man was cutting hay on the banks of the Don, and they found him. His mother was called in to identify him. I was with the younger one in the countryside. That was all. Afterwards, we were called back for the funeral.
While Chikatilo continued to kill, those around him still suspected nothing. In 1981, he had begun a new job as a supply clerk at the Rostov factory. Most of his working time was spent roaming the region, searching for material and spare parts. He kept himself to himself the few hours a week he spent at his desk at headquarters.
I worked with Chikatilo from 1981 to 1984. What is there to say about him? He was a dull, straightforward man who didn't stand out here in any way. Not good and not bad. Outside work, none of us had anything to do with him. When the newspapers reported what he had been up to, I was completely taken by surprise. For a long time, I couldn't believe it, until they produced all the proof and showed all this brutality.
By the summer of 1984, Chikatilo had killed more than 30 women and children, 15 of them within that year alone. Although rumors were spreading, the official media kept silent. No indication was given that a serial killer was at large. It was typical of the way the Soviet media focused exclusively on good news in the days before Glasnost. I was working for the news, and 5 times a week the police would bring us photographs of victims found, for instance, on the left bank of the Don or Shakhty.